The Blackwater-style mercenaries don't come cheap. They're extremely expensive, and the costs go up, and the oversight is virtually nil, because we'll say, hey, we'll pull out our troops, and then you won't get news reports, even as poor as they are. You know, it's just, hey, the mercenaries will just control and do what they want to do. It's kind of like the French Foreign Legion. The French finally just got fed up. Not that the Foreign Legion were not, you know, very brave, gallant soldiers, but it was sort of the idea that you had this unaccountable force that was fighting overseas, and you didn't quite know what they were doing. Well, the Blackwater-type mercenaries are, you know, they're 10 times less accountable than the French Foreign Legion ever was. And so I think it should become firm American policy that if we're going to fight, let's use uniformed people. That's what we have 1.3 million for. Why do we need to go out and hire mercenaries if it isn't to cloak the truth from the American people? That's the sole purpose in hiring mercenaries, is that they can do things that the American people would find revolting.
It's such an honor to have you as a guest, Senator Richard Black, on the Herland Report. You have an amazing track record and a career as a military colonel, then as a pilot in the U.S. Marines in Vietnam. Then you retired from the military and from various positions in the Pentagon in 1994. Then you embarked on a political career, and you have become one of the most renowned and well-respected men in the United States as a senator, with a broad understanding and a remarkable knowledge on how the world works outside of the U.S., and an understanding that has earned you this great respect. We're so honored to have you. Professor at Columbia University, Jeffrey Sachs, recently stated in a TV interview that the uprising in Syria was an American and a CIA invention. To what degree is there some truth in this?
There is reason to believe that the Syrian war was the creation of America. In other words, the concept of America, and that it was executed by the United States. And the things that people look at when they make this assertion are, first, just an astounding interview with General Wesley Clark, who was formerly the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO forces in Europe, the most powerful four-star general outside of the Pentagon. And he said that right after the 9/11 attacks, he took a visit to the Pentagon, and he was told on 2 different occasions that first that we had decided we're going to war with Iraq. He said, why? And the response was, well, we don't seem to know what else to do. Because Iraq had never been aggressive, and they were very harsh with terrorists. Terrorists never could get a foothold in Iraq. And so then he went back about a month later, and he asked the same general, presumably on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he said, and the general said, it's worse than that. He said, we have been ordered to prepare plans to overthrow 7 Middle Eastern nations within the next 5 years. And so we know that the planning for the Middle Eastern wars began as early as 2001. In 2006, we know from WikiLeaks that the American Embassy in Damascus published detailed plans for the overthrow of the Syrian government. And there were two things that stood out when I read it. At first is they said, there's such confidence in the world in President Assad and the First Lady, Asma Assad, who they're very much partners. So much faith in them because they promised to westernize and modernize and root out corruption in the country. So there's this tremendous influx of foreign direct investment, and it's causing a booming economy in Syria. So we have to smear the reputation of Syria so that we can begin to cut off that supply of funds. The other thing they said is that we have the opportunity to create religious divisions and hatreds between the Sunni and the Shia Muslim. We'll tell the Sunnis that the Shia are threatening to take over. Now, it was the most absurd thing on earth, because even though we talk about Syria being part of the Shia crescent, Iran is going to create the Shia crescent and the Shia are going to take over. The Shia worldwide only make up 15% of Islam. In Syria is a Sunni country for the most part. It's 70%. The Shia make up only 3%. So in the United States, it would be like saying, it would be like if the Catholic Church and the Baptist Church said, we've got to do something because the Jehovah's Witnesses, they're going to take over and they're going to take over the whole country religiously. It was obscenely absurd, but because they never published and no reporters ever said, how many Shia Muslims are there in Syria? Well, if the answer had been, well, a little bit over 3%. They just said, how are 3%, how does this become part of a Shia crescent when it only has a couple of little pockets of Shia Muslims? But nobody asked the question. And so to this day, people think, oh, the Shia are taking over in Syria. But the fact is that the Sunni Muslims, the vast majority, are loyal to President Assad. The vast majority of the army is made up of Sunni Muslims. But this has been concealed from the people. They say, oh, it's the Alawi. The Alawi, they may make up, maybe it's 8 or 10%, but it's not enough to fight this vast war. It's the Sunni Muslims who are fighting for the government led by President Assad. And something else. In 2014, President Assad decided we're going to have free and fair elections. He ran against two other individuals, highly respected individuals in Syria. They went to enormous pains to have the cleanest elections that they could. They even allowed people who were Syrian expatriates and refugees in other countries. They let them vote. They could go to the embassies and vote. The United States orchestrated the closure of all Syrian embassies in Western countries for one reason. We knew that if the American Syrian Americans, went to the embassy and cast their vote, they would vote for President Assad, and it would be a tremendous embarrassment. Same thing with England, same thing with France, with Germany, all of the other places where there are Syrians. So they held the election. President Assad won with just an astronomical victory. It was like 79%, and 3/4 of the people voted. I spoke with the ambassador in Lebanon, the Syrian ambassador to Lebanon, and they have a modest embassy there. And he described what happened on election day. He said, we never imagined what would happen. He said, all of a sudden, miles and miles of Syrians came to cast their votes. He said, we were in a panic how do we handle this? The people waited, and I've talked to people who were in the line. They waited for 15 hours in the blazing hot sun so that they could cast their vote. And a number of women told me, they said, when we got to the front, we took a blade and we nicked our forefinger and we signed in blood to make the point how tremendously important this election was. And when they say, oh, the Sunnis didn't support President Assad, 10,000 Sunni women gathered in a mosque in Damascus to rally for President Assad. They were Sunnis. They weren't Christian, they weren't Alawi, they weren't Druze, they were all Sunni Muslims, and they were rallying for him. So, and with the numbers, with 70% of Syria being Sunni, it's utterly impossible that you can get 79% of the vote unless most of the Sunni Muslims vote for you. So we've created these myths, and they're bizarre myths, and nobody ever questions them because the media, they get their marching orders. They're supposed to generate hatred against President Assad, against the decent Sunni people, and then they're supposed to talk about the rebels. Now, who are the rebels? The rebels are Al-Qaeda. And who is Al-Qaeda? It's the group that flew the planes into the Twin Towers on 9/11 and killed 3,000 Americans in the greatest attack on American soil in history. And now, who do we support? We support Al-Qaeda. And in Idlib province, where finally the Al-Qaeda forces have been bottled up, and they are headed by a man named al-Julani. The United States has declared him a special state terrorist and put a $10 million bounty on him. He is the commander-in-chief of all terrorist forces, all rebel forces in Idlib province. And yet, when the Syrian army they were rushing forward to conquer the last pocket in the main part of Syria, the United States threatened to take military action to protect Al-Qaeda, to protect the man that we have a $10 million bounty on. And we said, oh, civilians will die. Well, some civilians will die. And we have certainly killed our share. I mean, we have killed millions of civilians. War is that way. You know, I have never intentionally killed a civilian, but my job was dropping bombs when I was on the ground. I flew as a pilot, but I also fought on the ground, and I have dropped over 1,000 bombs. And sometimes you don't even know that there's civilians there, and and they get killed, and you know, there's a sick feeling when you realize that, you know, you've killed these people. This is war. War is a very horrible thing, and it's why we shouldn't engage in it when we don't need to.
So many in the United States have followed the lead of the mainstream media as to how to view the conflict in Syria. And as we know, over 90% of the American mainstream media is owned by only 6 corporations, and the same multinational corporations have high-stake interests in both military structure and the development of the military industry here in the United States, thus also profiting from the wars. But you are the #1 American official that has been in contact with the president of the Syrian Republic, Bashar al-Assad, and also been inspecting and been on the ground in Syria, inspecting the Syrian Arab army as they have progressed and finally were able to win this war. I think that's kind of safe to say today.
Yes, yes.
That is safe to say today. So why did you take a stance for President Bashar al-Assad and against the rebel structures that have invaded that country?
Well, what's important to understand, we have declared this war on terror. And in every war, now even though the war is a little nebulous, but in every war, there is typically a center of gravity. Military people talk about the center of gravity. The center of gravity is that thing which determines whether the war will be won or the war will be lost. Sometimes it's seizing the enemy's capital. Sometimes it's seizing his president or their president. Whatever it is, there is something that is the gem that wins the war. In the war on terror, the success or failure of the terrorists to seize control of Syria was the center of gravity in the war on terror. If Syria fell, then ISIS and Al-Qaeda would control a vast caliphate. Within a month or so, Lebanon would fall. Jordan would fall. They would control the borders of Israel, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And with this, now they would have captured the Syrian army, which, you know, by this time was very well armed, extremely experienced and trained. And the Syrian army would have to do what they were told by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda would have imposed one of it would have been a modern Holocaust of the Christians, because they had sworn to kill all the Christians and the Alawi, which together were 15 or 20% of the entire population. 2 million Christians and, you know, at least that many Alawi. And they had said under Sharia law, all of the men would be executed, and then the women and the children would be sold as slaves. And they've set up slave markets wherever they've gone. And somehow the Vatican seemed to be rather oblivious to this, and the American churches, I don't think, understood, because the media very carefully eliminated as many references as they could to Christians. They didn't want people to know that they were Christian. They wanted to know, oh, those are those Muslim people. You don't care about the Muslim people. Well, I've been to Syria, and honestly, I have met some very, very fine Muslim people, and you know, when I pray for peace in Syria, which is all the time, I pray for the Christians, but I pray for the Muslims, I pray for the Druze, for the Yazidis, for the Kurds, for all of the people of Syria.
The Judicial Watch, the public watchdog here in Washington, D.C., brings to light documents that are valuable to the American public. In 2015, retrieved the Defense Intelligence Agency's report from 2012, which clearly described who's allied with who in the Syria war. And in this DIA report, it was stated that the Salafis, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Al-Qaeda in Iraq are allies. On the other side of the fence, we do have the Iranians and the Syrians under Assad and the Russians. This was the way it was cited. And in the same report, it was stated as well that there could be a possibility of establishing in the eastern part of Syria an Islamic caliphate that could come in from the north into Syria. And this DIA report was from 2012, and ISIS didn't come until 2014, and the word ISI was used in describing this Islamic caliphate that one could establish. So of course this report went all over the world and was discussed by so many, particularly not in the mainstream media. How are we to assess and understand the covert operations that are going on in the Middle East, and to which degree is the United States, the CIA, and various agencies here using some of those Arab groups to achieve a greater geopolitical goal?
Yes, the Central Intelligence Agency became addicted to terrorism when we were opposing the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. We had Operation Cyclone, which was the biggest covert operation in history. We had 1/3 terrorists under arms, armed by Saudi Arabia and the United States. And we were trying to counteract the Soviet movement into Afghanistan. When that was going on, we ended up training Osama bin Laden. We ended up creating what became Al-Qaeda. And you would think that we would have said at the end of that, when the Soviets withdrew, we'd have said, this was really dicey. This was extremely risky and dangerous, but maybe we had to do it because of the Cold War. However, we didn't. The Central Intelligence Agency, I think, institutionally said, you know, this works pretty well. You generate terror and fear among people, and you can topple governments using it. And so it has become a tool to use. And in Syria in particular, we have worked to foster this. And there was a time, I believe around 2013, and this is very important, is Defense Intelligence Agency examined the Central Intelligence Program Operation Timber Sycamore, which was ultra top secret at the time. Timber Sycamore brought captured weapons from Libya. It also brought weapons from the United States, and it crossed the Turkish border into Syria, and DIA concluded that CIA had allowed this program to degenerate into an indiscriminate program where they armed all rebel groups, including specifically ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So here we were, you know, panicking about ISIS, and we were supplying them. And here we had been attacked by Al-Qaeda, and we were supplying them. And So these were the results that were very, very credible information coming out of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And fortunately, the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, he's the one who broke the information on the My Lai massacre, the Abu Ghraib misconduct, and when he started reporting on Syria, all of a sudden he was shut out of the media. And all of his publications had to be done through the London Review of Books, and you know, very, very respected organization. But he had been publishing through the New Yorker, and all of these, you know, New York Times would run his articles, all of these, as long as he was saying things that they were wanting said. But all of a sudden he was disclosing the great secrets of what we were doing in Syria, and they just cut him off completely. But we know about these things. We know how this worked, and it has not ended. Now, President Trump ordered an end to that particular program, but weapons still flow, and logistics and money still flow, because we're able to do it. We're able to say to the Saudi Arabians, hey, look, we've been cut off. You need to make up the difference. Qatar, we can do the same thing. You need to make up the difference. We have ways. And so the President of the United States is unable to control the flow of weapons.
At the time when we first heard the news of the chemical attacks in Syria, we all remember how this ended by the Syrian government disposing of its chemical weapons, and
Yes.
this was removed by Norwegian warships exiting through Cyprus and out into the Mediterranean Ocean. I do believe that was around 2014. But we kept hearing reoccurring and steadily new flows of rumors of Assad gassing his own people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, would you speak for what has been the documentation for these kinds of allegations?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important that in February of 2018, so 1 year ago, General Mattis, as the Secretary of Defense, just openly said, he said, we have no proof that President Assad has ever used sarin gas against his own people. It was stunning, and yet Newsweek ran it. There were a couple of little publications, but the big publications censored it completely, because we almost went to war. We almost invaded Syria in 2013 under President Obama. And we already had 6 guided missile cruisers off the shore. There were aircraft carriers, there were follow-on, there were troops moving everywhere, converging to invade Syria. And this was because of the first and largest use of sarin gas during the war. Now, a couple of months prior to this, Turkish border agents had broken up a ring of Al-Qaeda that were moving into Syria, and they seized 2.2 kilograms of sarin gas. And it was coming from Turkey, and it was going into Syria. And so there was an indictment brought against this dozen Al-Qaeda agents for using poison gas and introducing it. And President Erdogan of Turkey ordered a new prosecutor put in charge, and the new prosecutor dismissed all the charges and allowed those people to cross the border into Syria. According to Seymour Hersh, the Turkish agents took sarin gas into Ghouta, which is a suburb of Damascus. Damascus is a very sprawling, very huge city. And what they did is they had these crude missiles that the rebels used to fire on civilian targets in Damascus, and they used those to fire sarin gas, and they did, and they fired at civilians. Now, why did they fire at civilians? Why didn't they fire at military people? They fired at civilians because they wanted to create the image that somehow the Syrian government was killing civilians. Not one reporter ever asked the question, with this great war going on in Syria, with Syria defending on 5 different fronts, with them being attacked by mechanized divisions of terrorists, why would you choose, if you were going to use gas, knowing that you'd invoke the horror of the world, and why would you choose to use them on mothers and their children? Why wouldn't you use them on soldiers who are breaking through your lines and executing your troops? Why wouldn't you use them against soldiers? Not one reporter ever asked that question. And if you look at every one of the major gas attacks, there have been 3 major incidents that really hit the news in a big way. There's never been a reporter who has said, why don't they ever use poison gas on the enemy who are attacking them? Why would they always choose to use them on civilians? And the answer is, civilians evoke sympathy. And so you had these false flag attacks where the terrorists would kill civilians, because they don't care. They have no regard for human life whatsoever. They're barbarians. And so they would kill some civilians, and then they would photograph it, they would take pictures, and they would immediately put it out to the media. The media would take it, they'd run with it, and immediately accuse President Assad, who had the least to gain of anyone, the least to gain by poison gas attacks. In fact, the intelligence showed that during desperate times for the Syrian army, his generals many times had said, please release authority to us to use the sarin gas so that we can blunt this attack. Every time President Assad denied authority, he said, no, he said, we can't do that. Because he knew the impact it would have on world opinion. It would turn world opinion against Syria. And so the terrorists staged these attacks. The terrorists used the gas on civilians, and they used them as a pretext. They blamed it on President Assad and on the Syrian army. It was all false. And the amazing thing is that here, after all these years go by, the Secretary of Defense admits there is no evidence whatsoever to connect President Assad with these poison gas attacks. And yet we almost invaded Syria, and it would have been another war just like Iraq. For no reason. Syria has never done a thing to us. In fact, Syria is the model Arab country. When all of this began, they were one of the 5 safest nations in the entire world. A woman like you could wander the streets of Damascus in the evening in complete safety. Their constitution, and I've read their constitution, in 3 different places it talks of religious freedom. It talks about women's rights and women's equality. And it says not only does our Constitution say we will have equality, but they went beyond that. They said we will continue working to enhance equality. They talk about the rule of law. And you know, they were criticized by the Saudi Arabians. The Saudis said, we don't like your constitution. You need a better constitution. And guess what? The Saudi Arabians don't have a constitution. They have an absolute, brutal, barbaric, hideous dictatorship that murders people at will, that captures people in other countries and saws them to pieces, first suffocates them and then saws them with a bone saw and packs them into suitcases and takes them away. This is what Saudi Arabia, our close ally, is. I have watched 1,000 videos. Now, I don't even go to horror movies because I don't like violence. I really don't. But I like to get information firsthand. And so during the early years of the war, the terrorists wanted to terrify Syria and collapse their will to fight. So they would publish these hideous videos where they would behead people, and they'd show the beheadings. They would, they would shoot people. They would burn people to death. They would put people in cages and submerge them under the water. They would crucify them. And they would crucifixion, and they cannibalized enemies on the battlefield. And we called these the moderates. And then we demonized the Syrian army. I never saw a single video out of 1,000 videos that showed the Syrian army acting in any way that was other than what you would expect an army to do. They fought heroically, vigorously, but you never saw them brutally beheading people and this sort of thing. So we flipped things. We made people think that the barbarians were civilized and that the civilized people were barbarians.
It's a paradox when we look back at the pictures that first came out of the introduction of ISIS, entering Syria from the north towards Damascus back in 2014, because I have also worked in the Middle East for many years.
Yes.
And you could clearly see that those beautifully carved out photographs of these terrorizing groups that came in from the north, this very instant appeared in all the Western media outlets, the New York Times, the Washington Post, which, by the way, all over the world is often characterized as American advertisement firms and PR firms. Many people in the world look to read the New York Times to find out what the American establishment is thinking on a particular issue. And all these photographs of ISIS, in mysterious ways, appeared in all these great newspapers. The Arab man also now has his phone, his cell phone. All these videos started coming out and ending with Eastern Ghouta and the alleged attack there. We've seen the videos, how they act these scenes. And we've seen
Yes.
the white helmets in the photographs together with al-Nusra Front soldiers. I mean, it's not like it's a secret anymore.
There's clear evidence, absolutely clear evidence that the White Helmets are a terrorist group. It's been funded by the United States. We cut off funding at one point, and then I think we've started again. It's funded by Great Britain. And we've seen them falsifying things. They were involved in the Khan Shaykhun gas attack, which was sort of the second big gas attack. All of the information the United States relied on to launch our attacks, our missile attacks on Syria in response to that, came from the Idlib Media Center, which was run by the White Helmets and Al-Qaeda. And And the military, it came out later that the military had said unequivocally there is no question that the gas attack at Khan Shaykhun did not originate with Syria. There was definitely a bombing. They had bombed to kill some leaders. There may have been poison gas in that particular building. So we don't know that for sure, but the military was absolutely certain that there was no deliberate release of sarin gas by the aircraft that conducted the bombing. And part of the reason they know that is that they had very good interaction with the Russians. The Russians told them when the plane was coming, what its armaments were. They used smart bombs, which often the Syrians don't use, but they had been given smart bombs so that they could precisely hit that one building where the terrorist leaders were having a meeting. And all of this was disclosed to the American military so that there wouldn't be any confusion. Reportedly, 74 civilians were killed. Not a military person, according to this, was killed. According to the official figures that we publish. But the media never disclosed that the military had said absolutely there was no chance that this was a deliberate gas attack by Syria. The third famous one in Duma, the suburb of Damascus, is almost comical, because there is no clear evidence that there was a gas attack at all, that it even occurred. And this is the one where there were two little boys, and the white helmets took them, and the boys were hungry. They were scrounging for food, and the soldiers from the white helmets said, "Look, in the hospital, there you can get some figs, which sound delicious to someone who's starving." And so the boys said, "Yes, we'll go there." And they went down, and the white helmets had their cameras set up in the emergency room, and when the boys walked in, someone ran over with a hose. They turned on the hose, and they began spraying the boys, and the boys were startled and they were frightened, and they're there and they're looking, and there's people hosing them down and screaming and everything. And it turned out to be a complete fake. Once they got their photographs, they dropped the hose, they took their camera equipment, they left, and the two boys are just standing there. Then the boy, the one who was so famous in the media, he happened to have a very distinctive face, and within 2 days he surfaced, and his father was furious that the white helmets had kidnapped him in this way and taken him down to make this false photo, and he was just furious at them that they had taken his son. His son was fine, he was unhurt, and they reported that hospital, there were not many hospitals left in Duma. This was the main one. And people are always brought into hospitals, and as they get old, people die and so forth. So it's not unusual that you have several deaths in an evening. But just by coincidence, on that particular day when there was supposedly this sarin gas attack, there was not one death reported to the hospital, not a single one. So it was very ingenious to create a gas attack. The reason that it wasn't a real gas attack is that in the battle for Duma, the Tiger forces attacked from an unexpected direction, and they overran a chemical supply house where apparently, and this is a little conjecture, but apparently this is where the gas was to actually be produced that they would use for the incident that they were going to stage. and all of a sudden they didn't have any supplies. So no gas attack occurs, and finally the terrorists were forced to agree to a surrender, and the Syrian government was taking people out of the city on green buses, and then the terrorists said, "Oh wait, we want to delay for one day so that we can organize a little better." The Syrian government said, "Okay, we'll give you a day because we want this to go smoothly." It was during that day that they staged this false gas attack in Douma. And that was the reason they asked for the one-day delay, is so that they could create this propaganda ploy. As a result, we fired missiles without the slight. We didn't even know that whether there had been a gas release, but there was a claimed gas release, and we fired missiles on Damascus because of that. It just, it has become sort of a fantasy land over there where the Central Intelligence Agency comes up with schemes and they carry them out, and the American people, people can't follow things that closely, and they tend to just believe whatever they're told.
In the northeastern part of Syria, east of Deir el-Zor and the rivers, is where you find the massive oil fields and sources of massive revenue for both Syria and also, of course, for Iraq, further on the Iraqi side. This was the area that ISIS originally in 2014 came in and conquered as they went westward towards Raqqa and further into Syria. Now, while ISIS eventually lost some of their ground, the Americans then partnered up with the Kurdish groups that took control over the same oil fields and the same vast areas of wealth, Syrian wealth. And today, east of the Deir el-Zor, we see precisely the Kurdish forces reside. To what degree was it a practical and a good solution for the Kurds to join up with the Americans? And to what degree are we going to see the establishment of a Kurdish state?
Well, if you recall, John Kerry became very frustrated as President Assad was winning the war. He has won the war. It's just that it's very complex. There's not peace, but he has won. And so John Kerry, as Secretary of State, began to talk about Plan B. He said, it's time that we go to Plan B. Well, Plan B was to sever off a portion of Syria. It doesn't have a lot of population, but it does have the oil and gas wealth, much of the oil and gas, and also a lot of agricultural production. Syria as a nation, the entire nation benefits from the profits from the oil and gas. They feed from the food that's produced in the Euphrates Valley. And this area is cut off by the Euphrates River, which is a great source of water. It's the biggest source of water that they have in Syria. So the United States decided we'll bolster this Kurdish army. Now the Kurdish army, they fought bravely. A lot of different groups, the Syrian army, the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, a lot of people have fought bravely, and so the Kurds are in that. There's nothing special about them, but they have certainly been courageous. But we began to create this image, this great image of them, and we began to push back ISIS. It was much easier to do in this area that they control because it's very, very lightly populated. So many of the battles took place without civilian interference. And so we have carved off this area, and we have done it by convincing the Kurds that we're going to create a Kurdish state. Now, the population in northern Syria is about 20% Kurdish, maximum, maybe less, and about 80% Arab. Many of the Arabs are Christians, by the way. And the Arabs do not want to be under the iron fist of the Kurds. The Christians have already had considerable friction because the Kurds are shutting down Christian schools, and they're forcing the Assyrians, who are Syrian Christians, they're forcing them to change their language to Kurdish, which is not easy to do. So they're ruling with a very heavy hand. The largest city in northern, in this area, this Kurdish-controlled area, is Raqqa. Raqqa is 100% Arab, and essentially there are no Kurds there. And so when the United States went in to take it over, we were not at all cautious about civilian casualties, and we bombed Raqqa into oblivion. The Syrians have never used quite the same level of brutality that we did. We just smashed it, and apparently thousands of Raqqa civilians are just buried under the rubble. Very little has been done to reconstruct the city because we really do not want the largest city in northern Syria to be an Arab city. We want it to be Kurdish. What we have done, we've convinced the Kurds to have this Kurdish state, and it is so impractical. It's bizarre. It is bounded on three sides by Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. So if they break off from Syria, Syria will very much have tremendous animosity towards them. The Iraqis do not like them. The Turks have just a seething hatred of them. They have no access to the ocean. They have nowhere that they can fly civilian planes because Iraq won't give them overflight rights, Syria won't, Turkey won't, so they can't fly in and out. And any of their three neighbors can cut off their roadway access at will and say, you know what, we don't like you. We're not going to allow you to cross into Turkey or Syria or Iraq. It is so impractical, and the Arabs are already very restive. They're not willing to knuckle under to the Kurds, who are viewed as a little bit foreign. I mean, they came out of Turkey. They were driven out of Turkey. Syria gave them a home, and now they've turned on Syria. And so they're not beloved by the Syrians, but the Syrians incorporate every group, whoever they are. And so I have cautioned the Kurds. I said, this is very, very dangerous because it might be 10 years, it might be 15 years, but one day there will be a false flag attack where sarin gas is fired from the Kurdish area into Turkey, and all of a sudden 1,000 tanks come roaring across the border. And when the Turks come, the Turks kill men, women, children, everybody. They carried out the Armenian Holocaust, where they killed 1.5 million Christians, just butchered them. And so I've cautioned, I said, the only people who are your defenders are the Syrians. And here you're trying to break away from the Syrian nation. And this is a profound mistake.
President Donald Trump ordered the withdrawal of all American troops from Syria, I believe that was in December 2018. We're 3 months soon into 19. Would you explain what happened with that plan and how come it's not being carried through?
It was very interesting. Quite a while before, President Trump had announced that he intended to withdraw completely from Syria. But it was not a clear directive. It wasn't an order. It was just, this is the direction I want us to go. There's a lot of kickback. People said, no, we can't leave. He finally just ordered a full and immediate withdrawal from Syria. And immediately the deep state went into action. John Bolton, who is supposedly his national security advisor, jumped on a plane, flew to Tel Aviv, and announced that we were not withdrawing. He countermanded the President of the United States' explicit order to withdraw. General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, resigned, and I think, now this is pure speculation on my part, but I think that part of his motivation was to create a breakdown in the chain of command where the orders could be carried out. So, because all of a sudden there's not a top guy that you go through. And so you saw the deep state, all of a sudden, all of these think tanks were publishing articles about what a terrible thing, this would be a disaster, and so forth. If we had withdrawn, the war would have ended. And we knew that. President Trump knew that. If the United States pulls out, the war in Syria ends. And Syria becomes reunited, peace comes, and the people will just be joyous. So, as to my knowledge, not a single soldier, sailor, Marine, airman was ever withdrawn from Syria. I'm not aware, and I've been very careful looking for, I see no evidence that a single person has withdrawn. And there was some movement of trucks or something, but in fact, there even were reports that we were going to have to move some additional troops in just to facilitate the exit. I would like to hope that we still intend to withdraw some, but even the White House, first they came out about a week ago and they said, well, we're going to keep 200 troops in there after all. And 5 days went by and they said, oh, it's going to be 400 troops. Well, my guess, and this is just my guess from a lifetime of experience with the military, is that we have about 7,000 troops in Syria. The official number is 2,000. And then there was a very senior general who had a slip of the tongue and he said, oh, our 4,000 troops. And so I don't think it was incorrect. I think, if you're the guy who's in charge there, you know how many troops there are. And so I take that 4,000 as gospel. And then I know the way that we rotate troops. And if they're there for a short period, under 6 months, we don't count them. And additionally, we have Blackwater type people. It's not officially Blackwater, but they're mercenaries. We have mercenaries and we have technicians. Well, you put all that together, and I would say 7,000 is a very conservative estimate of what we have. You won't see a number that high anywhere reported in the media. They report what the Pentagon says, and the Pentagon has always played games with military numbers. This is not new. This is not new to the Mideast. It's gone on everywhere, but none of them have left. And to me, the fact that the president issued an explicit order, we will have a full and immediate withdrawal, and the fact that it was not carried out reflects that the president no longer has control over the Department of Defense, the State Department, CIA, the FBI, Department of Justice.
To what degree would you say that it constitutes a problem? The entry of, for example, Erik Prince, Blackwater, we've seen that over the years, operating in the Middle East. I do believe these companies have, since 1997, received $1.2 billion for unclassified operations. From CIA alone, I do believe $600 million. And now we see Erik Prince presenting the solution for Afghanistan on approximately, I do believe, $5 billion. This entry of mercenaries and private contractors and elements of this size outside of the control of martial law and the military in the United States, it somehow reminds us of the later parts of the Roman Empire where this also was a problem. How do you assess that?
I think it's a tremendous problem. I do not believe that it is appropriate for a free nation that we want to be using mercenaries. We still talk about the Revolutionary War and the Hessian mercenaries who came over and fought, and there's kind of this feeling mercenaries are bad, and I see them all the time. I go to Dulles Airport. I can pick them out. You look at them. You can identify them just by their personal appearance. They're all over the world. There was an incident in Syria recently where there were, I think there were 4 or 5 Americans, they said American soldiers killed. Well, one of them was a mercenary. We make extensive use of these, and they're able to do things that soldiers can't, because the soldier is under a chain of command, and there is a moral code, and they have to follow that moral code, or at least they're supposed to. But if we turn Afghanistan over to Blackwater, they may eventually bring about the financial collapse of this country. If we don't begin to shut down some of these wars and so forth, the debt of the United States is sort of like this, and it's going up and up. Before the Great Recession, we had modest debt, and then we took on this massive debt to bail out the reckless and crooked banks and so forth. And then an additional third of the entire national debt has been in the Middle East. Now, the Blackwater-style mercenaries don't come cheap. They're extremely expensive, and the costs go up, and the oversight is virtually nil, because we'll say, hey, we'll pull out our troops, and then you won't get news reports, even as poor as they are. It's just, hey, the mercenaries will just control and do what they want to do. It's kind of like the French Foreign Legion. The French finally just got fed up. Not that the Foreign Legion were not, very brave, gallant soldiers, but it was sort of the idea that you had this unaccountable force that was fighting overseas, and you didn't quite know what they were doing. Well, The Blackwater type mercenaries are, they're 10 times less accountable than the French Foreign Legion ever was. And so I think it should become firm American policy that if we're going to fight, let's use uniformed people. That's what we have 1.3 million for. Why do we need to go out and hire mercenaries if it isn't to cloak the truth from the American people? That's the sole purpose in hiring mercenaries, is that they can do things that the American people would find revolting.
Looking back to 2011 and the emergence of the Arab Spring, we saw so much positivity in the Western media. Now there was going to be victory for so many people under the autocratic systems in the Middle East, democracy, human rights, all of that. Shortly after the Tahrir Square and what happened in Egypt, there came the incident in Libya that developed from February 2011 and onward, ending with basically the brutal and merciless killing of the leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. We should remember that Libya at the time was Africa's richest nation, middle-income country according to the UN, equal rights between men and women, somehow secular, although Arabs, of course, would say it was a proper Muslim country. But we in the West would deem it to be somehow secular in the sense that Muammar Gaddafi was very much against the Al-Qaeda. He was a sworn enemy against them. Free education, free medical rights. This was the nation. Why were the NATO and the US so bent on coming into that country, which ended with the total destruction of the Libyan state?
Yes, the war in Libya fascinated me because I saw us attacking a nation that had been an ally. They were considered to be the most reliable ally in the war on terror in North Africa. And certainly the most successful, the most wealthy, the country with the greatest human rights of any of those in North Africa. And when we went in there, it was under the pretext, the Central Intelligence Agency, from my understanding, was involved in orchestrating the uprising in Benghazi. And in Benghazi, the terrorists took over and they began to kill civil servants, postal workers and people like that, just ordinary civil service. And they would just butcher them. And Gaddafi said, we're going to crush this, we're going to restore order. And he began to assemble a modest expeditionary force, which he thought was going to be sufficient to go in and restore order. We said, oh, he's going to kill everybody in Benghazi. It's going to be a mass slaughter. And so we have to establish a no-fly zone. And as soon as we established the no-fly zone, we used that as our authority to go in, and we began one of the most brutal and barbaric destructions of a nation in recent history. We ran 60,000 NATO airstrikes, and you think each of those airstrikes, the planes carry multiple bombs, sometimes 2,500-pound bombs on a plane. 60,000 of them, you think of the massive destruction. And we did not limit that to military targets. They didn't have that many military targets. We bombed civilian targets. We bombed all of the civilian infrastructure, the power plants, the bridges, the cities. The city of Sirte, which was the birthplace of Gaddafi, was a city of 300,000. now it scarcely exists at all. We basically just took it off the planet. And we showed no restraint whatsoever. The Moriartys who happened to be there, Jimmy and Joanne Moriarty, were business people, and they were on the 23rd story of one of the big high-rises in Tripoli, and they saw ships coming in, and they had these Toyota trucks with the heavy machine gun or cannon mounted on them, and they went roaring up and down the streets of Tripoli, just gunning down anybody in the street. And they got there with the permission of CIA, MI6, all of these people. So we totally crushed them. Now, you go back to your question, why? This is really what got me so involved in this. As I was curious, I thought, are we doing this for the oil? Well, wars typically have a number of different reasons, because everybody wants a piece of the action. And there is very, very fine oil that comes out of Libya, so that was an element. The two big things, the biggest single thing that the United States wanted was that in order to have good relations with the United States, Libya agreed to buy massive quantities of modern arms. And I think Gaddafi felt like, okay, if I am a good consumer and I give them my money for their arms, which they produce, then they'll be my friends. Well, he was wrong, because we decided we needed those weapons if we were going to overthrow a strong and stable nation like Syria with tremendous levels of popular support. We couldn't go to Congress and say, hey, look, here's the most modern country in the Arab world, the best run country, the safest country, the greatest women's rights, the greatest religious freedom. They're on the verge of setting up a 105-foot towering statue of Jesus Christ on one of their highest mountains. We need to kill them all and destroy the country, and so will you please give us appropriations to do it? That would be awkward for even some of the neocons in Congress to say, oh yeah, sure, let's go and wax those people. Let's cause a Christian Holocaust. And so we needed weapons. The CIA saw the source, and that was the principle, the number one reason for conquering Libya. Now, there were others. Libya had 179 tons of gold, 2,000 tons of silver, and vast quantities of strategic rare earth metals that were used to, in computers and things like this. They also had about $500 billion in cash, in various currencies. Some of it was in American, some of it was in euros, some of it was in Japanese yen. But it was a vast amount of wealth. It's gone. Nobody knows where it went. It all disappeared. But I do know from the Moriartys, when they escaped on a plane, there were these relatively small, heavily built boxes, and instead of people just picking them up and loading them, they used forklifts. And they found that rather curious. Why do you use a forklift for a little box like that you or I could pick up and carry off? And then one of the forklift drivers accidentally rammed a fork into it and broke the side, and these gold cookies came pouring out. And cookie is not the exact name for it, but basically they melt down identifiable bars of gold that have stamped numbers and so forth. They just melt them into patties about the size of a cookie. And this gold came pouring out of this one box, and of course everybody rushed quickly and they sealed it all up and got it taken care of. So we were already flying gold out. We don't know where it all went. Some may have gone to France. Some of it, there are rumors about some of it going to Haiti, which soon thereafter began gold production for the first time in Haitian history. They suddenly discovered gold in Haiti. So all of the gold, the silver, the rare earths were dissipated. So that was it. But the biggest thing was to capture the huge arsenal. And even as the fighting was going on, we turned over a captured airfield to Turkish authorities. Aircraft were flown in from Qatar, loaded with plundered weapons, and flown on into Turkey for provision to the Syrian terrorists.
I do believe it was the Judicial Watch that at that time were able to have precisely those papers released in the Hillary Clinton scandal. And it came surfaced that the weapons were transported so efficiently precisely from Libya to Syria and then to the insurgency in Syria. But a remarkable element also with the Libya war was the use of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was the Al-Qaeda in Libya, and its leader, Abdullah Kimball Hajj, who was with Osama bin Laden fighting for the Americans back in the day in Afghanistan, and who was not a notorious enemy of Muammar Gaddafi, who ferociously hated the Wahhabis and that kind of Islamic radicalism. He viewed it as non-Islamic. And as the Americans and NATO took over Tripoli, it was by the help of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and Abdullah Kimball Hajj became the military governor of Tripoli, and the Al-Qaeda flags were put on various buildings all over the country at that point. And later, Senator John McCain and Lindsey Graham went to Libya, and there's photographs of them saluting Belhaj and congratulating him on being a hero, a Libyan hero. I do believe Belhaj has become extremely rich, if not one of the richest in Africa since. So it's just a peculiarity to see how the Americans tend to strangely work hand in hand precisely with the remnants of that kind of mujahideen initial collaboration that you had in Afghanistan, Soviets. How do you explain these personas so close to the Al-Qaeda becoming so prominent and gaining such prestigious respect from the leading Republican senators in this country, such as John McCain?
There is enormous wealth and power that comes from involvement in these wars. I call it the Dow B theory. You know, you've heard of the Dow theory of stocks and bonds. Well, if you want to become massively wealthy, you do it through drugs, oil, war, and banking. And people who are really the key players in this, and I won't say any one particular person, but these are people who become so fabulously wealthy that they really are the American oligarchs, the people who benefit from the drugs, the oil, the war, the banking that ties it all together. There is evidence that elements of the Central Intelligence Agency have promoted the sale of heroin coming out of Afghanistan. Heroin production has massively increased since we went in there, massively increased. The Taliban, with their various moral code, they were not big fans of drugs, and while it's very hard to shut down the opium traffic, they impeded it. We have promoted it, and my guess and the rumors are that there are elements within the Central Intelligence Agency who have become fabulously wealthy on trafficking heroin, which comes into this country and is now helping to kill 70,000 Americans each year. So we have this situation where we have these globalists, and some of them are, they're Americans, some of them are British, some of them are from different countries, but they work together, and what links them together is the world media, which is centralized and censored and controlled. It is the banking system, which is on very, very shaky ground today, and is one of the reasons that we are so antagonistic towards Russia and China, because of the risk that the whole thing could come collapsing down if you have countries that unite around a hard currency, cash. Right now, we can print unlimited amounts of money as long as people still think that it has value. But there's a very real risk that if the Chinese, Russians, Indians, Turks, Iranians, if they start having some clearing system for a gold and silver based currency, people will say, what do I want? This one I can exchange for gold and silver. This one is paper. I think I'll take the gold and silver. If that ever happens, then the whole financial system comes crumbling down. All of this is interlinked, and you have these men without souls. You say, I could never do that, and I think most decent middle-class people could never do this, even if it benefited them. If I became a billionaire by making people starve to death, I would never think about that. But there are people who say, oh, okay, we can impose sanctions. Now, what do you do when you impose sanctions? You cause starvation, you cause a lack of medical attention, you cause ordinary poor people to die. That's what we're doing in so many countries, the sanctions. The purpose of sanctions is to make ordinary people suffer and die. There is a dangerous disconnect between presidential authority and the bureaucracy. It's a threat to the republic. It's a threat to our form of government. And we need to reverse it, or I think we will discover that our republic is no more.